Mark and I were excited about our trip to that secluded cabin in the mountains. We wanted a peaceful weekend, away from the city and the hustle of everyday life. We arrived at night, and the place was exactly as it looked in the photos. Rustic, small, and with a beautiful view. There was no one else around, just us and nature. The first night was great, until we heard a strange sound coming from the forest. It was crying. At first, we thought it might be an animal, maybe a wolf or something like that, but the crying sounded human. We shrugged it off, as it didn't make sense for a baby to be out there in the middle of the night under those conditions. We decided to sleep and forget about it. But the next day, something strange happened. When I stepped out onto the porch to have coffee, I noticed small footprints near our bedroom window. They were almost imperceptible, but they were there, leading from the edge of the forest to the glass, as if someone had stopped there, looked inside, and walked away. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried not to let fear take over. Mark, always the rational one, tried to come up with a logical explanation. "Maybe someone passed through here during the night," he said, but deep down I felt something was wrong. Night fell faster than I expected, and the tension that had lingered during the day only seemed to grow. Mark tried to stay calm, but I could see in his eyes that he was starting to feel uneasy too. The sound of the trees swaying in the wind seemed louder, as if something was moving within the forest. Suddenly, the crying came back. It started softly, but soon grew louder, more anguished. It was the same sound as before, a baby's cry, but it seemed much closer now. I looked at Mark, who was visibly worried, and he went to the window, trying to see where the sound was coming from. That's when he saw it. I didn't hear him move, but I felt his presence next to me, and then I looked outside too. There, standing at the edge of the forest, almost completely hidden by the trees, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The feeling I got was that I was being watched by something. The figure seemed to be staring directly at our cabin, and I felt a fear so profound that it seemed to suck the air out of my lungs. The crying grew even louder, as if it were right at our door. Mark froze for a moment, still staring at the figure in the darkness. I couldn't move either. The crying, now louder, seemed to come from the forest, but at the same time it sounded so close that it didn't make sense. The wind had picked up and the trees swayed violently, but the sound of the crying was clear, distinct, as if it were inside the cabin. Then the figure moved. Slowly, it began to walk toward us. A wave of terror washed over me. Mark finally turned to me, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He whispered, more to himself than to me, "Something's not right here." We stayed silent for a long time, just listening to that relentless sound, now more desperate. The figure had disappeared into the darkness, but the crying hadn't. It continued, louder, closer, and it seemed to be coming from just outside the window, as if someone were knocking, or worse, trying to get in. We decided to leave the cabin and investigate, but as we approached the door, the crying stopped abruptly. It was as if, in an instant, everything went still. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like the whole world has stopped breathing. I looked at Mark, and he seemed as confused as I was. We were in an isolated place, far from any town, and there was no logical explanation for what we were hearing or seeing. We stood at the door, staring into the dark, unsure of what to do. The silence was deafening, but the fear lingered, a constant weight in our chests. Mark was the first to break the silence, speaking in a low, tense tone. "Let's check outside the cabin." I didn't want to go. The fear was so overwhelming that my legs felt paralyzed, but he didn't give me a choice. Reluctantly, we stepped outside, armed only with the dim light of a flashlight we had brought. We walked to the edge of the forest where the figure had vanished. The ground was covered in a thin mist that spread as if trying to swallow everything. I looked around, searching for anything, but there was nothing, just darkness and trees. The crying had disappeared, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. Mark started walking deeper into the forest, and I unwillingly followed him. Each step we took seemed to echo, as if we were walking into a trap, and the silence grew more unbearable the further we went. That's when the flashlight beam landed on something I'll never forget. Small footprints, almost childlike, in the damp soil. The problem was that the prints seemed to come from within the forest, but also led back to the cabin. They were fresh and they were close. My stomach churned. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Mark crouched down to get a better look, and that's when I heard it. A soft voice, so faint it was almost a whisper coming from nowhere. "Go back." The voice was so clear and distinct that chills ran down my entire body. I froze. Mark looked at me, clearly trying to process what we had just heard. "Did you hear that?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I didn't know what to say. There was no one around. There was no explanation. Whatever was out there was communicating with us in a way I couldn't understand. I looked at the footprints again, feeling a growing dread. The sense of being watched was stronger than ever, as if invisible eyes were on us. The crying, which had stopped briefly, suddenly came back, louder and closer. But now it wasn't coming from the forest, it was coming from our cabin. Without thinking, I grabbed Mark by the sleeve of his jacket, and we started running back to the cabin. The sound of our footsteps seemed muffled, but the crying persisted like a haunting melody following us, something alive that knew exactly where we were. When we finally reached the cabin, everything was silent again. The door was closed, just as we had left it, but I had the overwhelming feeling that something or someone had been inside. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be possible, but the sense of being watched only grew. I looked at Mark. He was pale too, but trying to mask his fear. "Let's leave," he said. And I didn't want to, but I also knew we couldn't stay. Something was wrong. Something was waiting for us. We decided to leave immediately, but before we could take a single step, the crying returned. Only this time it was inside the cabin. It was as if a baby were right there with us, but there was nothing. There was no baby, just the two of us, frozen, listening to that unbearable crying. I was paralyzed, my hand over my mouth, trying to contain the panic threatening to overwhelm me. Mark was so tense he could barely breathe. He moved toward the window, flashlight in hand, and when he looked outside, he saw the figure again. This time, it was closer. It was a human-like silhouette, so distorted, so dark. It didn't seem to belong to this world. We stood there, unsure of what to do. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. All I knew was that this wasn't normal, it wasn't human. And then, out of nowhere, the crying stopped. The silence was absolute. The figure vanished. All that remained was the echo of that strange, oppressive feeling. It was as if we had been warned, forced to leave without an explanation. I never found out what happened. We don't know who or what was in the forest, but when I looked one last time, there were no more footprints in the soil. There was nothing, just darkness and silence. In the end, we decided to leave that same night. Mark drove nonstop to the nearest town. We didn't say much on the way because there was nothing to say. To this day, I can't understand what happened in that cabin or what was watching us that night. The only thing I know is that I will never go back to that place. When I moved into the apartment with Emily, I wasn't expecting much beyond a quiet routine. We had just gone through a major life change, and I wanted a simple, cheap, yet cozy place to start over. The building was old, but it was quiet and seemed safe. However, on the very first night, something strange happened. At 2 a.m., I heard the sound of heavy furniture being dragged in the apartment above. It was loud, as if someone was rearranging furniture, but the building was empty. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be some kind of echo, but Emily, who was a light sleeper, woke up startled, saying there was something in the hallway. I calmed her down, but that uneasy feeling lingered for a long time. In the following days, things only got worse. Emily started saying she saw someone watching her through the windows, but when I looked, there was nothing there. She insisted the person was there, standing still, staring at her. I tried to rationalize it, maybe it was just her imagination, but each night the noises upstairs grew louder. One night I woke up to a sound so loud I thought the ceiling was about to collapse. I finally decided to investigate and went upstairs to knock on the door, but no one answered. The apartment was empty. I didn't know what to think. So, I decided to research the building and its previous residents, and what I found left me speechless. A former resident, a woman, had disappeared years ago without a trace. The research left a knot in my stomach. The missing woman, named Linda, had lived in the apartment we were now in. She lived alone, and the last people who had contact with her said she seemed agitated. as if someone was watching her. I wondered if Emily was seeing something I couldn't, if somehow Linda's spirit was still there, trying to communicate. But what disturbed me most was that no one had been able to explain her disappearance. The police never found a body or any solid evidence. All that remained was the mystery and a sense that something was wrong with that place. Something was waiting. Something that thrived on fear. One night, after weeks of strange occurrences, the noises reached a peak. The sound of furniture being dragged was more intense, and this time, Emily was crying, saying, "The woman is there at the window." I tried to calm her, but fear overtook me too. That's when I heard a soft knock on the door. It wasn't from anyone in the building. No one lived in the adjacent apartment. Hesitant, I peeked through the door crack and saw no one. But when I opened it slightly, I felt a cold breeze coming from the hallway. At that moment, Emily's crying grew louder, more desperate. She was pointing to the window, and for the first time I saw it, a pale figure with dark eyes staring at us from outside. I couldn't breathe. What was that? And why was it watching us? I felt a weight on my chest, a pressure so strong it was like the air was being sucked out of the room. I looked at Emily, who was frozen in fear, pointing steadily at the window. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but it was impossible to deny. The figure was there, motionless, just watching us. It was as if time had stopped, and that presence was the only real thing in that moment. I wanted to scream, and run, to do something, but I couldn't move. In a sudden impulse, I pulled Emily behind me, away from the window. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I panicked. It was as if it had never been there, but the fear remained, embedded in the walls, in the air inside me. I knew we had to leave, but something held me back. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the feeling that something had already claimed us, that we could no longer escape. The noises continued, and Emily's sobs grew louder as the night dragged on. I decided to make one last attempt. I called the building manager, asking about what had happened to Linda, her disappearance, anything that could explain what we were experiencing. When I spoke to him, there was a long silence before he finally said, "I've never told anyone this, but some people say Linda never left. They say she's trapped there, that she didn't want to leave. Maybe she wants company." When I hung up, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer a distant presence. It was right there, close to us. That night was the worst yet. Emily's crying wouldn't stop, and no matter how much I tried to comfort her, it only seemed to grow louder. I looked around, feeling the eyes of that presence in every corner of the room, as if we were surrounded by something invisible but tangible. I locked every door and window, but the fear was so overwhelming, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Then, in a moment of desperation, I grabbed Emily and ran into the hallway. I tried to get to the ground floor to call for help, but when the building's front door opened, an unbearable smell of mold and dampness filled the air. The hallway was longer, narrower, and the lights, which had always been dim, now flickered as if they were about to go out. The sense of being in a nightmare only grew. Then, amidst the chaos, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and to my surprise, no one was there. But I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched became so intense, it was unbearable. Emily screamed, and I pulled her closer, feeling her cold hands. I knew we had to leave, but the doors wouldn't open. The building didn't want to let us go. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so fast it felt like it would explode. And then I saw the apartment door open on its own, as if inviting us back in. Emily didn't want to go. She begged to leave, but something inside me knew that if we went back into the apartment, we would never leave again. The fear of an invisible, threatening presence was so overwhelming that I simply started to run. When we finally got out, the relief was immediate, but nothing made sense. The building, which had once seemed so normal, now felt like a haunted place, feeding off our fear. Emily and I went to a friend's house and never returned, but the feeling that the presence was still with us, watching, never left me. No matter how hard I tried to move on, I couldn't forget. The following nights were filled with nightmares, always the same scene. The figure at the window, the strange noises, and the constant sensation of being watched relentlessly. Months later, while passing through the city, I saw the building again. It was still there, standing, but with an even stronger sense of abandonment. Somehow, I felt that Linda's story was far from over. She was still there, waiting, watching, and no matter how much I wanted to forget what I had experienced, something inside me told me that place would never let me go. I don't know what really happened, but after everything, I still wonder, did we actually escape? Or is that presence still with us, waiting for the right moment to call us back? I'm not one to stay late at the office, but that night I really didn't have a choice. It was Friday. The deadline for an important project was approaching, and I needed to finish some final adjustments to the layouts before sending them to the client. The building was practically empty. Most of my coworkers had left by 6 p.m. I was so focused on my work that I barely noticed how silent everything had become. Then my computer started acting strangely. First, some files began moving to different folders on their own, as if someone was remotely controlling the machine. Then a message appeared on the screen: "You shouldn't be here." I was confused and thought it was some kind of bug or a bad joke from someone in IT. I decided to ignore it and kept working, but the discomfort only grew. I heard the sound of typing coming from a desk not far from mine. I looked up, expecting to see a colleague working overtime, but there was no one there. It must be an echo or just my imagination, I thought, trying to convince myself it was just exhaustion. Still, the sound of typing seemed so real. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was even worse. I stood up to check the other cubicles, and that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The office was completely empty. I tried to shake off the uneasiness and went back to my desk, convinced I was imagining things. But when I got there, something new was waiting for me, a small piece of paper on the keyboard. "Don't leave yet," it said, written in shaky, almost childlike handwriting. My heart started racing. I looked around, expecting to see a coworker hiding somewhere, perhaps waiting for my reaction, but there was no one. The office was steeped in dim light, illuminated only by the glow of my monitor. I decided to check the security cameras on my computer, but when I tried to open the program, the screen froze. Then I heard a faint sound like footsteps coming from the hallway leading to the exit. My breathing grew heavy and I began questioning my logic. Maybe someone had stayed behind, or perhaps it was the janitor. I grabbed my bag and started walking toward the sound, calling out to anyone who might be in the building. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed louder than I expected, but there was no response. When I reached the hallway, all the lights began flickering before shutting off entirely. The silence that followed was deafening. That's when I realized the footsteps weren't coming from just one spot. They were everywhere, as if multiple people were walking around me, but I couldn't see anyone. Instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight, but the screen wouldn't turn on. I tried calling someone, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I heard a soft click behind me, like a door opening. I turned around slowly and saw that the meeting room door, which I knew I had left closed, was now slightly ajar. A faint, barely noticeable light flickered inside. Every part of me told me not to go in, but something compelled me forward, as if I didn't have full control of my actions. I walked into the room, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the absolute silence. When I pushed the door open, the room was empty. The light was coming from a projector in the back, but it was only displaying a blue screen with occasional interference. That's when I noticed the window was completely covered in handprints, as if someone had desperately tried to open or pound on it. The prints were small, like a child's, but they covered the entire glass surface. Panic began to set in, but before I could react, the projector turned off by itself, plunging the room into darkness. At that moment, I felt a presence behind me, so close I could swear someone was breathing on my neck. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating. I didn't dare turn around. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in the room. Then I heard a whisper right next to my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded distorted, rasping, like someone trying to speak while choking. My body froze completely, and all I could do was clutch my bag to my chest, as if it could protect me. Suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched noise echoed through the room, like glass shattering. I instinctively turned around, illuminating the area with my phone's flashlight, which finally decided to work. There was no one there, but the handprints on the window had disappeared. Without thinking twice, I bolted out of the room into the hallway. The feeling of being followed was overwhelming, but I didn't look back. I just wanted to get out of the building. When I reached the elevator, I realized it wasn't working due to the power outage. I headed straight for the stairs, but as I pushed the door open, I froze again. At the top of the staircase stood a silhouette. It was tall, thin, with unnaturally long arms, and it just stood there, as if watching me. The worst part was its face, or lack thereof. It was featureless, just a dark, blank void. Before I could react, the figure began descending the steps toward me, each step echoing like a hammer in the silence. Adrenaline took over, and I ran toward the emergency exit at the other end of the hallway, not caring about the noise of my footsteps or the icy air growing heavier with each passing second. Behind me, the figure's steps grew louder and faster, as if it was gaining speed. I slammed into the emergency door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Desperate, I started pounding on it, screaming for help, but I knew no one would hear me. The building was in a commercial area that became completely deserted at night. Slowly, I turned back, cornered, and saw the figure standing at the end of the hallway, motionless. The distance between us seemed to shrink with every blink, even though it wasn't moving. And then everything fell silent again. No footsteps, no breathing but my own. The figure had vanished. I stood there, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what was happening. Just when I thought the worst was over, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. It was a light touch, but enough to make me scream and collapse to the floor. I looked behind me, but there was nothing there. Tears blurred my vision, and all I could think about was getting out. I decided to run to the nearest window, prepared to break it if I had to. But before I could take more than 2 steps, the sound of typing began again. This time, it came from my desk, as if everything was starting over. Terrified, something drew me back to my desk. It felt like I was being pulled against my will. When I arrived, my computer was on again, despite the power outage. The screen displayed an open document with words appearing on their own, one by one. You should have left when you had the chance. My hands trembled so much I could barely hold my phone to shine its light around. Then I noticed something in the corner of the screen. The computer's camera was on. My own image was there, but behind me, reflected in the monitor, was the same figure from the staircase. It was closer now, hunched over as if studying me. I spun around, but the space was empty again. The feeling that I wasn't alone was suffocating. I grabbed my bag and ran for the exit, not caring about anything else. I stumbled down the stairs in the dark, nearly falling, and when I finally reached the ground floor, the glass front door seemed impossibly far away. As I crossed the lobby, I heard the sound of typing again, but this time it came from all directions. When I reached the door and shoved it open with all my strength, it finally gave way. I stumbled outside. Looking back through the glass, I saw something I'll never forget. Every computer screen in the office was on, displaying the same message over and over: "You're never alone." The fresh air of the street hit me like a shock, but the relief was short-lived. I was safe outside, but that phrase kept echoing in my mind: "You're never alone." I couldn't bring myself to look at the building again. I pulled out my phone to call a cab, but it still had no signal, as if something from the office was still with me. I walked away, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that suffocating presence. When I finally reached a busier part of the city, I started to believe I was free. But then I noticed something that made me freeze. In the reflection of a cafe window, I saw something impossible. Behind me, among the passing crowds, was the same figure, standing still, just watching me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Even so, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I hailed a cab and went straight home, praying that it was all just a product of my exhaustion and imagination. But to this day, whenever I'm alone in an enclosed space, I feel a faint touch on my shoulder or hear the distant sound of typing. No matter where I go, it feels like it never left.